Hey everybody, it's Ed. Before we start, I want to thank our newest Patreon supporter, Chelsea Clockey. Thank you very much for supporting the podcast on a monthly basis through Patreon. There's a long list of everybody who supported the podcast, either monthly or on a one-time basis, on mountainprairie.com/support. You can go to that page to check out all the different options. And another way you can support the podcast is to share it with a friend. Either tell somebody about it, share it on social media, give it 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. All those things don't take much time, and they have a really big impact. So thank you to everybody who's done that over the years, and thank you to those who are going to do it after listening to this. Hope you enjoy this episode. Hey, this is Ed Robertson, and this is the Mountain Prairie podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in land conservation or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work, has an interesting story, and loves the American West. If you're a longtime Mountain and Prairie listener, then I'm sure you've heard me reference the author and historian Peter Stark. He's written some of the most memorable books I've ever read, including one of my all-time favorites, about the early history of the western United States. A thrilling tale of adventure and exploration called Astoria, John Jacob Astor and Thomas Jefferson's Lost Pacific Empire, a story of wealth, ambition, and survival. Peter's also spent years working as a correspondent for Outside Magazine, and he's written extensively for magazines including Smithsonian, Men's Journal, The New Yorker, and more. I've been a fan of Peter's for more than 20 years, so when I was offered the chance to chat with him, I jumped at the opportunity. The focus of this conversation is Peter's newest project, an and audio book titled Sins of the Founding Father, George Washington, the Indigenous Tribes, and the Decisions That Shaped America's Future. It's an in-depth exploration of an often overlooked battle in 1791 between American troops and indigenous tribes, a violent fight that was decisively won by the Native Americans and resulted in 3 times more American deaths than the Battle of Little Bighorn. The book also covers the life and personality of George Washington, America's insatiable hunger for land, and the United States' uncertain future in the years just after the Revolutionary War. You might be wondering, what does George Washington have to do with the present-day American West? Back then, the term American West described a region now known as Ohio. Well, as you'll hear in this conversation, this specific battle set the course of action for the next 100-plus years regarding the United States' policies towards indigenous tribes. The Americans' crippling defeat led Washington and other leaders to ramp up their violent tactics against native tribes and hold nothing back in their quest to claim as much Western land as possible as quickly as possible. It's an eye-opening story that gave me a much better understanding of the ambition, egos, and economic realities that laid the foundation for the modern-day West. Sins of the Founding Father is available exclusively at Scribd, and there's a link in the episode notes that'll give you a free 30-day trial. Scribd is a really cool app, and I've enjoyed using it for and audiobooks. So go to Scribd.com to check it out. Sins of the Founding Father is a great read, and at only 70 pages, you can enjoy it in one sitting. I hope you'll check it out, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Peter Stark, I was just talking with you before we started recording and how I've been a fan of your work since I bought your book, I think from Borders Bookstore, which is no longer in business, Last Breath. And I've been a fan of your stuff for so long. So I'm really excited to chat with you. I'm going to do my best not to mess it up. So maybe you'll like me a little bit too.
I'm not worried about that, Ed.
Well, we're here today to talk specifically about your new piece with Scribd called Sins of the Founding Father, which I just absolutely loved. And it's one of these books or ebook / audiobook that really opened my eyes to a part of U.S. history that I don't know much about. And so I was thinking maybe the best way we could start is to talk a bit about George Washington. And in the intro to this podcast, I will have given some background on the book and what it's about and everything. But Could you just kind of set the stage with young George Washington, who this guy was? Because you've written a book about that subject, and it's the reality of young George Washington clashed with my very limited knowledge of George Washington, because I thought he was just kind of this prim and proper fancy guy, but that's not the case. Can you talk a bit about young George Washington?
Yeah, oh, definitely. And, as you know, I'm an adventure wilderness writer, and now I'm writing about exploration history. And the way I got into George Washington was I was doing an article or a research in the wilderness woods of Western Pennsylvania. And this is, quite some years ago. And I kept stumbling over this 22-year-old guy who was a Virginia colonial officer who was really making a mess of things out there in the woods in 1752, 53, 54. And it's George Washington. And I'd never heard about this guy, like you hear about the guy who's the statue George Washington, who's the great, commander in chief, and then the president, the selfless president, which he was. I mean, in so many ways, a great leader who made this country stable as possible at the time and stepped down from power when it came time. And yet here he was like this guy out there. And the more I learned about him, I mean, he was like vain. He was ambitious. Mm-hmm. He was arrogant. He was in love with his best friend's wife. He was self-centered. He inadvertently set off the French and Indian War. I mean, this guy is so ambitious. It's really hard to set off a war when you're 22 years old, unless you have some extraordinary ambition. And he did.
I was so surprised about that, just because I had the public school history book version of George Washington in my head. And I admitted that I've not read your book, Young George Washington, but I ordered it last night. And so I'm really excited to dig into that. But this current piece that we're going to talk about today really talks about George Washington as the president in the newly formed United States, which is another part of history that I just haven't studied all that much. One other thing to set the stage, could you talk about young George Washington and even grown-up George Washington, his kind of lust or real passion for land acquisition?
Yeah. That's so much a part of who he is. I mean, through his whole life. And he, as I think almost all Americans know, he grew up in Virginia. He was a Virginian. And his family they were plantation owners. And, these are plantations with enslaved workers and, in the tobacco fields. And yet they weren't like a top tier plantation owner. They were kind of middling plantation aristocracy. And his father died young, and George is very ambitious to kind of climb that Virginia aristocracy. And we have to remember, this is in the 1740s, 1750s. This is not the United States. This is a British society, British colonial society. And after his father died, George had very little education, partly because his father died and didn't send him to boarding school in Britain the way the father had sent the older brothers to boarding school in Britain. But then the father died, so George was kind of left at home on his own resources, had maybe a 7th or 8th grade education. And so to kind of make a way for himself in the world, he picked up surveying, and he taught himself to survey with his father's old instruments. And his father had done some surveying too. Well, the thing about Virginia, that Virginia, British colonial Virginian culture, it was where the first British colonies in North America, for the most part, started at Jamestown. And that was, 1607, I think I've got it. And they very quickly discovered that tobacco was an extremely profitable crop to sell in England. And so the Virginia, these colonists, they were literally, at the edge of the wilderness. They're starting to grow tobacco. But the problem with tobacco is it exhausts the soil so quickly. Yeah. And so these Virginia plantation owners, they constantly needed more land to plant tobacco. They constantly needed fresh lands, and then they'd exhaust the lands and moved on. So there was this incredible passion, lust for land in this Virginia plantation culture. And George was very much a part of that. He grew up in that. That's what a lot of the surveying was about. And he, as a young man, well, as a teenager, started surveying. And then by the time he was 18, he was surveying professionally, like as a freelance surveyor. I think he was 16 or 17, actually, when he started making money at it. He bought his first piece of land at age 18. I mean, here's a guy with no education to speak of, or very basic.
Yeah.
And he made enough money to buy a piece of land. And the first piece he bought was very significant in that it was in the Shenandoah Valley. And Ed, you know the terrain out there. We people who live in the West are much dimmer on the topography. but Ed can explain to every listener that the Shenandoah Mountain or the Shenandoah Valley it's like the first valley over the mountains. So if you're coming in from the Virginia coast and Jamestown and all the huge plantations and start traveling inland, the country starts rising, and it turns into the Piedmont country, I think they call it. And then you go over this ridge of mountains. There's this beautiful ridge. It's called the Blue Ridge, and it's the first line of mountains of the Appalachian chain, and that's a very significant part of the story too, the Appalachian Mountains. And George bought his first piece of land just over that first ridge of mountains. And then he made a career as a young man of surveying in that area that was just over the mountains. It was kind of the edge of the frontier at that point. And he, through that experience, he became very well acquainted with land, with measuring it, with, you read his early journals and letters and diaries, which I have in great length. It's amazing how well he knows his tree species. He can identify 8 different types of oak tree because these are the trees he uses for his corner markers of the lands he's surveying. So he has to identify exactly which tree he's using as a marker. So that's the background on where he was coming from. And then as there's a whole other story that's in this Young Washington book about how as an ambitious young guy in his right around 2021, his older brother died, and his older brother was like an officer in what would have been maybe the equivalent of the Colonial National Guard. And so after his brother died, George tried to work his way into that same officer's spot. And he did get an officer spot. It was a kind of a less glorified one. And his first task was when the British governor of Virginia, Governor Dinwiddie, sent him way, way, way deep in the wilderness, hundreds of miles, almost to Lake Erie, in winter, to send a letter to a French commandant who was building forts back there and saying this is French territory in the Ohio Valley, that huge Ohio wilderness, which of course there were many, many Indian tribes, which it wasn't wilderness to them, it was their home. And so the French were building forts up there saying, we've claimed, this is our French claims, has been for, a century. But the British and the Virginians are saying, oh, no way, that's Virginia land. Those are our colonial claims. And so George's task is to deliver this letter to the French commandant from the Governor Dinwiddie, which tells the French guy, hey, these are our lands, get out. And so there's a whole saga there, and George almost dies various ways. He almost died. He falls into a frozen river off of a raft. Ice flows running down the river. He comes very close to dying. I mean, like within an inch of dying of hypothermia, which I describe in some depth, the best I can. I mean, on the available journals. And then he gets out of that experience. He goes through the French and Indian War, which he has a big part in triggering. And once the French and Indian War, once the French are essentially kicked out of the Ohio Valley, George quits, and he's been in the war, going back and forth between the wilderness, in the Ohio wilderness, and the plantation country for 5 years as an officer. At one point, leading the Virginia regiment, and when he gets out, right away he marries Martha.
Yep. Who was extremely wealthy, right?
And she's the wealthiest widow in Virginia. She's like 26 and he's like 26 or 27. She has 17,000 acres of land and many, many enslaved workers on her plantations. And so George marries her and instantly is vaulted to the top of the Virginia aristocracy. And he becomes a successful planter. And he's very focused. So this would be the years. These are the years we don't really hear about in American history about George Washington's life. Between the time he was in his early 20s, early mid 20s, and he had this French and Indian War experience. And the time he was in his early 40s when he was named commander of the Continental Army. I think he was like 41 or 42. So there are 15, 20 years in there where he's a Virginia plantation owner. Now a big wheel because he has all of Martha's land, and he's very self-motivated, self-educating, experiments with different crops. But one of the things he's really, really focused on this entire time in all his life until his deathbed is investing in land, speculating in land, and especially speculating in Western lands, because this is how the Virginians had lived from the very beginning of the British Virginia culture. They'd buy lands farther west, and then they develop it into plantations, and then they could sell it and potentially move on. So it was really like sort of our version of real estate developers buying raw ranch land and turning it into golf courses or something.
Oh yeah, unfortunately, I know that very well.
So yeah, the dynamic, and so that's what on a whole different level, mid 1700s level, is what George Washington was trying to do, and so he was trying to acquire as much land as he possibly could in the what was called the Ohio wilderness, and the land over the Appalachian Mountains, many ridges beyond that first Blue Ridge. And one of the ways he acquired thousands of acres of land in the Ohio wilderness was because of his service in the French and Indian War, his service to the Virginia colonial military, in a way his service to the British Crown or their colonial administration. He, as an officer in that fighting, was awarded 3,000 acres of land in the Ohio wilderness. Mm-hmm. And so were his fellow officers. And so were, a number of the soldiers, because, the British colonial, government, the Virginia colonial government, they didn't have a lot of money either to pay these guys who had fought for several years in the woods. So they said, we'll give you land instead. And it's land way back in there. And of course, there are Indian tribes living on that land. So the land is in a very gray area of who's claiming what. And plus the French had just been there saying it had been theirs. And George, over the course of some years, buys the land certificates from his fellow soldiers and from his fellow officers. And he's also doing it on kind of the down low. He's asking his brother to go approach a fellow officer that George served with and ask in a joking manner if he'd be interested in selling his land. Mm-hmm. And through this, George acquires thousands of acres of land back in the Ohio wilderness. And when in 1774, things are kind of heating up to the colonies are becoming quite rebellious. There's a certain point in 1774. So this is actually only months before the first shots, heard around the world at Lexington and Concord. Some of the British, high officials in London and likewise in the colonies say, well, actually, all those land certificates we gave to the veterans of the officers in the French and Indian War, well, we're actually only giving that land to officers who were in the British Royal Army. We're not giving it to officers who were in the Virginia Colonial Army. Oh, wow. So that means that George has essentially been stripped of all these lands he's been trying to speculate in. And it sent him into a rage. And he writes these letters about how ill-treated he is, an American citizen, and American colonists are, and on and on and on. So that's kind of the setting the stage, at some depth of topography and real estate speculation of where George Washington was coming from on some of these issues. I mean, he was coming from an entirely different direction on a lot of the political issues, but he had a deep interest in Western lands.
Yeah, and the thing I find so interesting, I mean, it's an interesting story by itself, but with my focus on the modern day Western United States, he, in a way, and tell me if I'm thinking about this wrong, but it's like he created the playbook for this land hunger, land greed, the breaking treaties with native tribes, like everything that happened during this time period was the foundation that just continued over and over, even today. I mean, there's not as, at least that I know of, as much of the breaking the treaties, but there's the greed-fueled development of wide open spaces. And I feel like everything that you just described was really the first time that had happened on this continent, and it's just a playbook that has been repeated for centuries since. Is that an accurate way of thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. In a very broad sense, yes. And George Washington wasn't the first guy to speculate in Western lands, At the same time that he was speculating, so was Patrick Henry and Benjamin Franklin, and a bunch of these guys were. Mm-hmm. But he was really passionate about it. George was, and he really knew those Western lands because he'd traveled through them. He'd canoed, he'd hiked, he'd ridden, and so he really knew the geography. But the key point that you're making is that he was a fundamental creator of that kind of template to acquire lands to the West in this continent. And there are a lot of ways that they were acquired in very dubious and also violent methods from Indian tribes, and then use those lands as, speculation assets to sell to people who are starting a new life moving west. And yes, you're right, it hasn't stopped today. But George was, you're right, I mean, in the very, very thick of it at the foundational moments of this nation.
Yeah, it's almost like real estate speculation is one of the most core American values, if you want to call it a value, but like it's been there since the beginning.
Yeah, well, and I'll jump in right now and say, I've done years and years of research in this area in George Washington, and really looking at the documents and letters and journals and everything else. And when you really follow it in kind of a step-by-step way, it becomes so apparent. And, and especially then we get into the interaction with the Indian tribes and so-called treaties and whatnot. But it becomes so apparent that this nation was built on this incredible abundance of land. And that's where so much of this nation's original wealth came from, that almost infinite resource of land. Of course, it wasn't really the colonists' land to begin with. In a lot of ways, it's still not in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But that it was such an underpinning for how this nation came to be, and also for its wealth. The incredible abundance of land that was almost free, not quite, but almost free, unless you were Native American, unless you were a tribal member, and then it was not only not free, it was taken from you with huge violence and tragedy and duplicity and everything else. But for people coming to this continent, it was this incredible asset, which everyone who's come to this continent benefits from in some way today.
We have to skip through a massive part of history that we could probably talk for thousands of hours about, from young Washington through the Revolution. But I want to talk about this battle, or I want to set the stage for the battle that your new piece covers. So we move up to 1791. We're a few years out of the end of the Revolutionary War. Things are not, the United States is by no means a sure thing at this point. It's tenuous on a lot of different levels. Can you set the stage for, or talk a bit about where the United States was in 1791? I think, maybe from a constitutional standpoint, financially, what was happening. What if you could just paint a brief picture of 1791 in the brand new United States?
The image that's come to mind when I've been writing about this and thinking about it is, that we who live in the West kind of have a picture of this. But when there's like a mining boom or a gold rush or silver rush.
Oh yeah.
And there'd be some little mountain valley or out on some plain that there are these all of a sudden these like frame structures pop up, and these tacked together buildings out of wood, and how they're raw lumber.
Yeah.
You've ever seen like really green lumber where it's not planed and it's rough and it's green and it's still kind of wet, and it's sort of tacked together. It's kind of hard to nail together, and there's sort of big kind of bent nails holding the thing together, pounded in there. Well, I kind of think of the structure of the U.S. in 1791 being built out of that stuff.
That's great. I like that.
And they got it up, so to speak. They'd erected it, but it was, there were a lot of things that were pretty shaky about it. And, as you were saying, no one really knew if it was going to work. And it was this grand experiment. So 1791, the revolution, technically started, 1776, and it technically ended 1783. And then 1783 into like 1787, you have the Confederated Congress. And then in 1787, they start working on the Constitution. And I think that goes up to kind of like into the late 1700s. In 1791, the year we're talking, the Constitution had not been fully ratified by all the states. Mm-hmm. And there was the George Washington in 1791 had only been in office 2 years. I mean, the presidency had only existed for 2 years. The whole thing was really, it was really this raw green scaffolding kind of nailed together pretty quickly to see if it would work. And so nothing is certain at all. In this moment, what's happening is that more and more white settlers are going over those Appalachian Mountains and settling or trying to settle lands in the wilderness of the Ohio Valley. And there are many Indian tribes in the Ohio Valley who have lived there for literally thousands of years who are saying, hey, wait a minute, stay out. This is ours. And it's a very complicated story about there's a lot of interaction from, say, just before the revolution until the date we're talking now, 1791. So that's 25 years or so. A lot of back and forth. A number of treaties that were really, it's like a trick card game, some of these treaties that were imposed on the Indians, including the one that allegedly brought Kentucky into the British colonies and then into the U.S. So a lot of settlers were going over the mountains saying, well, there are treaties where we can settle here. And there were a lot of conflicts in the Ohio Valley and bloody conflicts between the tribes and the settlers. So in 1791, this has been building up for a couple of years. The country is brand new. Yeah. And George Washington says, okay, we got to go punish the banditti, like the bandits back in the woods. And so first in, I think, 1789, 1790, he sends in an expedition, kind of a smaller one, to go like destroy, some of the Shawnee villages in what's now Ohio, kind of towards northern Ohio. And they, managed to burn a few villages, and then they get their butts kicked by Indian tribes who have joined forces to some degree and ended up ambushing these guys, attacking them, driving them back. So it was a big loss for this Harmer campaign. So that disaster happens. And then Washington says, we can't have this. We got to go after this seriously. So here's one of the big problems. Here's where the scaffolding of the nation is like, green 2x6s. Yeah. So at this point, the founding fathers had been adamantly opposed to having a standing permanent army for the United States, because the standing permanent armies, they were the machines, the instruments of despots in Europe.
Yep.
That's what the tyrants used to crush their people, standing permanent armies. So the founders adamantly opposed. And the idea initially in the founding days of the country and the Constitution was, instead of having a standing permanent army, that each state would have its own militia. And that in times of need, if there were a need for national defense, those militias would come together and act, in coordination. So here's George, and he's, the quote unquote banditti are, out there defying what he wants them to do in the Ohio Valley. Settlers are trying to move out there. The nation, it's really like an infant baby nation, mm-hmm. and it has no money. And it has no money after the revolution. And these Western lands are also considered, it's like the U.S. bank account. It's the savings account. That's how the U.S. is going to pay so much of its debt, by selling, getting the lands from the Indians and selling them to settlers and others. And that's, all this money is going to come into the U.S. There's not really a taxing system in place in the infant U.S. at this point. So these lands are essential for the growth of the U.S., both physically for, the expanding population to settle, also financially, because that's how it's going to solidify its finances and pay its debts, is by selling these Western lands. And thirdly, it's really important for the U.S. to have a buffer on its western edge, a strong border, because there are all these other empires circling around. You got Spanish, you got the French, you got the British. The U.S. managed to carve out a space among all those empires, but who knows how quickly one of those empires could just come back and try to crush the U.S., the infant U.S. And so it needs like a buffer on its western lands. You have to remember everything west of the Mississippi was Spain. That was Spanish territory.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that's not very far away, Mississippi River. So we get to this point where it becomes a very important matter to discipline, punish, whatever, these Indian tribes in the point of view of Washington and, sort of the cohorts in the federal government. And we could take it from there, but that's kind of the setup.
Yeah, and there's a good, I thought there was a really great paragraph kind of towards the end of the piece where you talk about how the, Washington, as a result of the battle we're going to talk about, but he had this idea that if he and his administration and his country couldn't fight off and win against these, the quote enemies, Native Americans who they didn't really respect, how would they have any chance of fighting off France or Spain or anybody else who might show up? So it seems like there was this almost like an ego component as well. Like
yes.
we gotta lay down the law out here. Yeah, and the thing you said about the land, or the United States, the land being the bank account, I think that's a really great way, kind of a great analogy, just to think about the history of the settlement of the United States, because that's, when you think about it that way, it makes it very clear why everybody was just so cutthroat and ruthless to get out there, because it was just in a way, money for the taking if you were mean enough. All right, so we get to the battle. I don't want to ruin it. I want people to read the piece.
It didn't end well.
Yeah, did not. I mean, it made Custer look like a raging success.
It made Custer look like a raging success, and so Washington, and through his Secretary of War, Henry Knox. I don't want to get too much in the weeds on this, but it's not even clear, like who really authorizes how to go to war, who has that power and who can summon up an army, and all that sort of stuff is still being worked out. And one of the very significant things that Congress did in the Constitution is saying that whatever military force that Congress or anyone can fund can only be funded for 2 years, because the idea was that any tyrant who wanted to get together a standing army and take over the country, he'd run out of funding after 2 years. And so it wouldn't work. So that's how, kind of tenuous the whole military was. And so Washington and Knox, they kind of cobbled together this force that's partly, kind of regular paid, semi-trained soldiers, and partly various state militias, like from Kentucky and Ohio and, the various volunteers and whatnot. And in 1791, starting in the spring and going into the summer, they moved these troops to what's now Cincinnati. It was then just not even a village. It was like a few grog shops around the base of a fort called Fort Washington. Yeah. And they moved these troops out to Fort Washington in Cincinnati. And, there are all these problems and delays, and, because this is way out in the woods, way out in the wilderness, and to bring this big, force, which is, right, it's supposed to be like 3,000 or even 3,500. But by the time they kind of get it all together, it's maybe a little more than 2,000. And Washington keeps saying, you got to get this thing going. You got to get it going. We got to get this done before the winter. And so Washington's pushing really hard to get this force launched. And there's so many delays, it bogs down. It bogs down all through the summer. It finally gets launched in early fall and September, October. And it chops its way 100 miles in the direction of these villages, Miami and Shawnee villages called Kekionga, and also called the Glades. This is, again, up in kind of northwestern Ohio and northeastern Indiana, just south of Lake Erie. And they they chop their way, which is a huge project. You know, they have
I couldn't believe that. That blew my mind. The work that was involved in getting through the woods. It was crazy.
Oh, it was crazy. And, they're in columns, and they've got all these soldiers, and then they've got feed their army. It's really difficult. And they don't have enough flour, and, the contractors back in wherever, I don't know, the East or Pittsburgh or wherever, weren't delivering reliably enough. And so they're trying to get these pack trains of flour, they're waiting for like a pack train of 200 horses carrying, thousands of pounds of flour. And they can't really move farther till the next pack train comes because there's no food. And so they're chopping their way up in the woods, and, no signs of Indians. And the general leading them, Arthur St. Clair, who's actually a Revolutionary War hero of sorts and an old colleague of Washington's, comes down with gout. He's so sick he can't even ride his horse. He's carried on a sling between two horses. And kind of everything starts getting really sketchy, and it gets colder. Men start deserting because they're saying, this is ridiculous. And they're on half rations. They're not getting food. The liquor ration's running out. That's really key. And so they start deserting. St. Clair has two of them hung as an example to everybody else of deserters. And they keep going. Part of the philosophy being that on the part of the officers, like, if we get these guys deep enough into the woods, they can't desert because there's no way they can get back on their own. so they're stuck for the duration. So this is how desperate this is. But they're seeing no Indians. And they finally get to this place, November 3rd, 1791. And they come to a river, and they think it's one river, but it's actually not the river they think it is. It's a small river. I don't know, maybe 60 yards wide or something. Yeah. And they set up camp on a low bluff next to this river, meaning like 30 feet high. And it's a sort of wooded bluff. And that's going to be their defensive position for the night. And the officers send the Kentucky militia, who are really the kind of obstreperous wild guys, to set up an advanced camp a few hundred yards across the river on the other side, kind of a more open terrain, more kind of meadow and open trees. There's some talk about building fortifications that night, and the men are like, we're too tired. And St. Clair is apparently not very engaged in all this because he's so sick with gout. Mm-hmm. And there's a patrol that goes out, and they kind of have some kind of encounter during the night, and there's shots. And so people are just getting nervous. And St. Clair's ordered the men to sleep on their arms all night, meaning they're all ready to go, like their guns are right next to them and I think loaded and ready. And they get summoned at dawn by the drummer, and they start, it's just before dawn and starting their formation in camp. And, there are also a lot of women and children in this camp because they're nurses and cooks and their families. And so it's not just soldiers, it's a big camp. And it's just getting light when they start hearing this ringing sound. And one of the officers describes it like an infinitude of horse bells all ringing at the same time. Mm-hmm. And it's this eerie sound that rises from all around them. I mean, from, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of yards, the sound is just floating up all around them, and they can't see where it's coming from. And then bad things start, and it's really bad.
Yeah, it really is bad. And
it's, if you were saying that what's so wild about this battle is that, I mean, not what, it's why the thing itself is wild. It's a battle that doesn't really have an official name. It was so bad and so humiliating. It's really been swept under the rug of U.S. history. And, sometimes it's called the battle with no name. And that in the end, it was 3 times worse than Custer's last stand. Mm-hmm. 3 times more soldiers died there than at Custer's last stand. And it's still, I mean, in all of American U.S. history, it's the worst defeat that the U.S. forces ever suffered at the hands of Indian warriors. And the tribes had put together a confederation, coordinated all these tribes, and St. Clair walked right into the middle of it.
Yes, and I'm going to tell people they need to read it to get the full story, because we want to leave it a little bit suspenseful. But it's wild, and there are 2 things that come to mind. One is, when you're telling these stories, I'm thinking, when I was in elementary school or middle school or whatever, I didn't care about history, and I think it's just because they make it so damn boring. And people like you and other historians I've had the pleasure of getting to know, you put this stuff out in a way that is so engaging that you'd have to be kind of brain dead not to want to learn more. I just appreciate the way you tell these stories, because I mean, really, I was a adult when I got obsessed with history, and it's because of people like you. And so I don't know. I just wish the U.S. educational machine could do a little better, because it's so. I mean, it's so awesome. And by understanding this, it makes me understand the American West better, and it makes me understand some of the crazy nonsense that's going on today in Washington, D.C. So I love it. And
part of that is, that I do feel. I mean, I feel flattered for you to say that, and that part of it is the effort that I undertake, and there are other writers of history who do it, not all, but to try to make the events as vivid as possible, and while still being historically accurate. And that it's not easy. I mean, it takes a lot of work to have, be really true and faithful to the facts, to the journals, to, the accounts, and at the same time try to make it come alive. And one of the things that's kind of germane to you and your podcast, and with its Western orientation, is that, I did start out a lot as a young journalist. I pretty quickly got into magazine writing and writing a lot of adventure, travel, and extreme adventure sports pieces. A lot of them for Outside Magazine, and also doing a lot of, I grew up doing lots of outdoor wildernessy things, and I did a lot more once I started writing about it. Mm-hmm. But it's that experience that almost informs my writing of history more than anything else. And that's, when I talk to audiences at like historical societies and whatnot, I say, I don't really do original research in that I am not going to uncover some, undiscovered letter that George Washington wrote in 1768. There are literally thousands of professional Washington scholars, and they work on, this is what they do. So I'm not going to come across any new document. I'll come across kind of weird facts that I like to weave in that other people might not have seen. But what I do bring, what I call my original research, is that I know what it feels like to fall into a half-frozen lake in the middle of winter, which is what you fall into a river, which thank God I've never done. But I know what that feels like, and I know what you feel like when you get out, and I know how hard it would be to start a fire with your fingers and flint and steel after you got out of that, which is what George Washington had to do. And if he had to do it himself, he would have died. He had a guy a very good guide who managed to start the fire for him to thaw him out. But it's all those experiences, running through a frozen woods, when it's 10 below zero in the moonlight, something Washington did. I've done that myself. I know how things look. I know how things feel. And so that's what I call my original research that I bring to, I try to bring to bear on these stories, which I do focus in the history I do is focused on these wilderness settings in a lot of ways, and exploration, at least for the European American white guys. They're kind of going into the edge of the unknown. So I focus on that kind of history, and I love doing it, and I love trying to bring it alive that way and shaping it into a story. And to your point about, you wish there was more history like that taught in schools. I think what's happening is that it's, sometimes it's called narrative history.
Yes.
And it's a genre that's actually coming on pretty nicely at this point. I think it really sort of died off for quite a long time and there was so much history. There's just like very academic and non-narrative and sort of statistical and just, dry. And yet this narrative history has become it's become a much more popular genre, and which I'm very pleased about. And it's, that's kind of what I do. And so I have hope that we can bring more understanding of history to both, people in general, the American public, and to, school kids by bringing them into these stories, these alive, vivid stories that illustrate what was really going on and how these stories illustrate much larger issues in our nation's history.
Yeah, when you talk about what it feels like, we could do 3 or 4 podcasts just on your book, Astoria, which is one of my favorite books. I mean, I love it. But I think one of the reasons I love it is because when I was in college, I did a semester with the National Outdoor Leadership School in the Pacific Northwest. Yeah, we spent the most memorable part that I remember, we did our little solo expedition or small group expedition without instructors on the Olympic Peninsula in the mountains, and it was like 45 degrees and rained nonstop the entire time. And so when you're telling those stories about those guys, just being soaked to the bone and freezing, but not quite cold enough to actually freeze over, just enough to be real miserable, I fully connected with it. So. It made me kind of like, it made me think about that time fondly, but it also made me glad I wasn't there anymore.
Yeah. Well, and you can, I mean, it brings the story alive that much more when you understand what these guys went through. I mean, how brutal it was. And, writing this book, Young Washington, and the script piece, Sins of the Founding Father, just have an understanding of how hard this stuff was and how tough these people were. The American settlers, men, women, and children, the Indians, incredibly tough people and survivors, and so smart in in what we call the wilderness, they call home. It just brings a whole new appreciation to that, to being out there when reading some of this.
One question about your process. I really think I thoroughly enjoyed literally every paragraph of it. And one, I really zoned in on the author's note at the beginning. And 2 things stuck out. One, the first one that I'd love to hear more about is the outreach and the research you did with modern day Native American scholars and experts, because you named off a lot of them, and I underlined all those names because I feel like I would love to have the opportunity to chat with them on this podcast. Can you talk about how you beyond the primary sources and the normal historical documents, what kind of outreach you did with Native American experts?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting point. And we spent quite a bit of focus on trying to do that. No, it wasn't, I have to say, it wasn't all that easy. It's in part because, I think one thing that a lot of people who are not Native American don't understand is the Native Americans just aren't one voice, aren't one people. It's like saying, Asians or Europeans or it's to say they're, Indians, Native Americans, Indigenous. It's, that's a very broad classification. And within that huge group, there are hundreds and hundreds of distinct tribes. And in a way, hundreds and hundreds of distinct cultures and languages and points of view. And within each tribe, then there are, countless points of view and takes on the world and politics and current events and whatever. And so, to try to get a Native American opinion on, the history of the West or contemporary event or some of the events, these historical events that I talk about, one person doesn't feel they can speak for all people.
Sure.
So, it's that at least we found it was difficult to get a voice for someone who would speak to the broader issue. But there were, as quoted, as you saw in the acknowledgments and quoted in the book itself, I mean, the script piece itself, it's some experts who were very specifically experts in their field. One, Tim Holter, who practices, Indian law, and had a good, perspective on how sort of treaties unfolded historically and some of the issues to be aware of in that sense. We also had a constitutional expert, Matt Waxman, who's a constitutional expert at Columbia, who could explain, how the Constitution is, as he puts it, silent on a lot of things. These are kind of the holes in the Constitution. And then we spoke a guy who you might be interested in having on your show, and I would hope you'd be interested, Mark Grahant, who long time the editor of the Indian Country News,
Yes.
longtime professional journalist, has a really good perspective on, as a journalist, he's covered so many issues over so broad a spectrum that he can really address, big picture issues with, a sense of having covered a lot of them professionally. And so it was great to get his perspective. And one of the things that was kind of both illuminating and well, really insightful, I should say, for us, who and my wife was a big help in writing this article and researching Amy Ragsdale, that when we were talking to Mark Trahant, he was saying, you have to remember, we've been around for a long time, and like 200 years is nothing to us. That he's a member of part of the Shoshone. And he said, well, my ancestors were hunting, mastodon when they were here, when they first came here. And so we've been dealing with these, for instance, climate issues for a long time. And it's like, we're here, we're not going away. And he also made the point that, and he was quoting a Navajo leader, who was saying we lost 95% of our lands, to the kind of the white sweep across the continent. We had, lost 95%, but that means we still have 5% left. 5% is a lot of land. It's a lot of land, and it's a tremendous resource. And that as Mark was saying, that there's a shift in point of view going on, that to start seeing that land, those assets, as a resource, and using them, thinking of them in a positive way to develop as a resource, for economic, for cultural renovation, for all sorts of things. So that was a really interesting perspective that we heard, trying to hear some of these voices.
Well, yeah, I'm excited. I was glad to see all those names, and I highlighted all of them because I would love to chat with those folks. Although I get real nervous about chatting with professional journalists like you, and because I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm sitting here in my basement.
We're chatting. It's like, discussion, roundtable, whatever. As you know, I've been working on a book about, the great Shawnee leader Tecumseh for now. I'm just finishing it. It's almost been 4 years. Be published next summer by Random House. Tecumseh and his nemesis, William Henry Harrison. And so I've been researching, this period that we're talking about, right, this battle, 1791. That was part of my research for this Tecumseh book. And I spent, months actually researching it and working on it and kind of shaping it into a story. And then it turned out that it wasn't quite as central to the Tecumseh book as my editors and I thought it might be. And so it was kind of not exactly cut out or thrown out, but it was more put to the side. But then last summer, what I started thinking, we were dealing with all, such political turmoil we've been through with, we had the Black Lives Protest matters, and then we had the election, and then the charges of the stolen election, and then January 6th, and then the January 6th committee, and the investigations. And what was amazing was, wow, all these issues, these are exactly the same issues that arose in 1791 after this battle, this battle with no name. And the first kind of most obvious one was that after this incredible disaster out in the Ohio wilderness, when the word came back to George Washington at the president's house at Philadelphia, as he was having dinner with guests and was taken aside, and after the guest left, he utterly exploded behind closed parlor doors to his private secretary. He went into this incredible rage, which the private secretary recorded almost word for word. And you never imagined George Washington like this, to hear him. Unbelievable. He was so angry. And, I speculate the reason he was so angry is because you could see not only was the incredible loss of life and tragedy, but this nation, here we are with a raw green 2x6 is barely tacked together. And, this prototype of the U.S. Army just gets its butt kicked and destroyed out on the Western frontier, shoved back. Suddenly the U.S. doesn't have control of the whole West, the Western frontier. And the things are shaky enough on the East Coast, because the revolution is barely won. And so Washington's just seeing what an utter disaster this could be. And both in terms of strategic militarily and in terms of public relations. I mean, this does not engender a whole lot of confidence in the nation when it's just barely getting on its feet. And so he explodes. And meanwhile, Congress says, what was that? How could this have happened? What's this terrible disaster? And Congress is barely on its feet. It's just a couple of years old. Yeah, at least this, current version. And Congress says this has to be investigated. What went wrong here? We can't have it happen again. So Congress, the first thing, at least some members of Congress, their first reaction is, okay, yeah, we need it investigated. We'll have President Washington investigate it. He'll figure it out and give us a report. And then somebody else stands up and says, well, wait a minute. If something was really wrong on the U.S. military side, well, Washington, he's like the commander who sent these guys in, and it's his Secretary of War. And so if something's really wrong, he's going to have to be in Washington. President Washington is going to have to be impeached, but he's not likely to impeach himself.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't have President Washington run this investigation. We should do it. Congress should investigate. And so now it's like, wait a minute, should Congress investigate the executive branch? Mm-hmm. And the country is so new. Nobody's thought of this before. Like this, the branches are supposed to be equal. But now all of a sudden Congress is proposing to investigate the executive. And so Congress says, okay, we're to do it. And then, so Congress, first thing that Congress does is sends a request to Washington saying, we need to see your papers pertaining to this. And Washington's like, hey, wait a minute. This is not the way it's supposed to work. I'm the boss over here. And they're wanting my papers. And so Washington, and he's, for all I've said negative about him in many respects in his land speculation, he was in so many ways a great leader and so aware of what he was doing as he was putting this country together. I mean, he really was indispensable. And so, he's very cognizant at this point. So, military disaster, Congress investigating, Congress coming to him and saying, we need your papers. And he's saying, I don't think so. But he's really cognizant about how he's setting a precedent that's going to play down through history. He's very aware of that. And so he convenes his cabinet at this moment. And this is how young the country was. The cabinet, I don't know how many people are in the cabinet now, like 12, 15, something. Yeah. At this point, there are 4 people in the cabinet. It's Jefferson, Hamilton, Secretary of War Knox, and Edmund Randolph, who I think was the Attorney General. And so the 4 guys, they ponder this with Washington. Do we let Congress have these papers, these so-called private papers of the president? And so they hash this over in a cabinet meeting. And later, they never come out with an official policy. But Thomas Jefferson later describes, because he was at that meeting, big participant in it, and he describes, okay, what we decided was the chief executive, the president, will turn over to Congress those papers that benefit the public good. Mm-hmm. However, he will have the discretion to withhold those papers that could prove detrimental to the public good. So here we are, we're 230 years out. We're kind of in the same place. I mean, literally.
It's the same story. Yeah, the only thing we need is the FBI to show up at Mount Vernon.
Well, he didn't have Mount Vernon. He was in Philadelphia. But yeah, it's crazy. And then then these other issues arise, that who has the power to declare war? Do we need a standing army? And, as Matt Waxman, the constitutional professor, said, it was always such a concern, and it has been throughout history of the U.S. and constitutional concern, what happens, or how do you prevent the army from turning, or the military army from turning inward? Mm-hmm. And that wasn't something that was well, there wasn't really a way to address it well in the Constitution, that because there's so many different issues at stake. You need a commander in chief, but then, who can rein in the commander in chief if he's, getting tyrannical and calling up the military, and what's Congress's role? And so all these things were so much alive in that moment in 1791. And then another huge issue was that, what grew out of this was another huge factor, theme, dynamic that's played out through the history of the United States to this very much alive this day is how this battle, this defeat, really in a lot of ways hardened U.S. policy towards Native Americans.
Yes.
And,
yes.
From this point on, there were a lot of problems ahead of time, but after this, it was a much firmer, harder policy towards Native Americans. And Washington he could be very tough on Native Americans. There were lots of things that happened during the Revolution, post-Revolution that he was involved in. But that attitude, it just got worse over the decades. And, it was like one thing after the other that, we're stripping whatever rights that Indians were accorded in the Constitution. It says in actually the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which was written just about the same time as the Constitution, very boldly states, Indian tribes shall be respected at all times. Their goods, their lands, their property should never be taken from them. And, they have to be respected unless in the case, there's like a caveat, unless in the case of a just war.
Yeah, so I remember that part.
Yeah, it was like there's the hitch, and that just war, that little phrase clause, that ended up U.S. military swept across the continent by the end of the 1900s.
Yeah, I'll tell you. I think when I was just thinking what I like in history, and first of all, entertain. I love the way that you write in this entertaining manner that makes it so fun to read, and then it allows me to connect these centuries back to modern day and make me understand what's going on now a little better. And then the other thing that I like is reading something like this piece. It makes me curious to learn more on a broad scale about a bunch of new topics that I previously didn't know anything about. So kind of to wrap things up, could you recommend a few other books? You mentioned some in the author's note at the beginning, but books either about this particular subject, about Washington, that may be worth reading, and then maybe just a few of your favorite books. I'm always looking for great books to read. So
okay, yeah,
so are the listeners.
Yeah, the problem with me on this subject is that because I'm doing so much historical research, a lot of the books that I read, most of the reading I do is kind of like diving into pretty detailed historical subjects.
Sure.
And so it's not always like fun reading unless
you do that. You do the boring reading and the hard reading for us, and then you make fun reading for us. So I appreciate that.
There's a fun one for you. I'm just joking, but the Annals of Congress from March 1792, when they're trying to decide whether or not to investigate George Washington. Well, like the day before, the Congress is having a huge debate they're about to start minting the first U.S. coin. And there's a huge debate that goes on for days about whether or not to put Washington's head on the coin or not. Or if there's going to be one head on the coin, well, there should be three heads on the coin because there are three branches of government. Or should there be liberty on the coin? But liberty could be like a bear breaking off its chain. That could be the image of liberty. So these guys are having hashing out. It's just kind of funny that they haven't figured out how the country is going to work yet.
It's crazy.
But one of the books in the course of this that it's such a picture into this era and the culture and the Native American culture from an outsider than insider point of view. It's the journal of a young white guy who was captured, probably in Wisconsin or Illinois when he was 2 or 3 years old. It didn't have a clear memory of his parents or his background. And then he was captured by the Potawatomi, and he eventually ended up in a more of a Plains Indian tribe and grew up there. And many years later, he wrote an account of his life with that tribe, and it's so interesting to hear the details of their life and kind of it's almost the whole frame of mind that you start seeing it from an inside perspective through his eyes, because he becomes part of that culture.
Yeah.
And the way I got onto it was because he was present in 1810 out on the plains, and his tribe there was a big gathering of tribes, and Tecumseh, the great Shawnee leader I'm now writing about, traveled from the Ohio Valley. He was rallying tribes all over the continent, but he spoke to this gathering of tribes, and the young captive now, Potawatomi or Osage, this is John Hunter Dunn, was there and witnessed Tecumseh's speech, and he recorded it, and he wrote it down later.
Yeah.
But the detail, I mean, just the imagery is so powerful. And to hear this Indian oratory, it was, really great to have this account. So that might be fun to read one of those early captivity journals, John Dunn Hunter, or another one I like is by a guy named James Smith. I don't know, kind of memoirs of a captive. They're all kind of memoirs of a captive. I just find those totally fascinating. The books, you were talking about recommendations, and the ones that I kind of go back to are the ones that really influenced me as a writer, kind of developing. And this was in the 70s, and I never, it was sort of a new world to hear, to read nonfiction being written in this kind of narrative way.
Sure.
And ways in which you could take it in a lot of different directions, including personal and emotional and spiritual. So two big books from that era that I read were had a big impact, and it's not the same to read them now. I mean, I find them harder going, but they're still really important. It would be The Snow Leopard.
Yes, a lot of people mention that one. Yeah.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. And I have not read it, but so many people I admire, that has been a big part of their life. So I need to wake up and read it.
Yeah. It's really it came at a moment where it opened up a new world. The journalism there was the new journalism that had been going on for a few years, but this was something different and very kind of close to the earth and spiritual at the same time and personal. And it blended all those together in a way that I never would have thought possible. Another, John McPhee was another big influence as a great, coming into the country. There's a great Western book, classic about Alaska. And then at the same time I read, and I was talking about it the other day, there was this great Native American literature conference here in Missoula named after James Welch, who was Blackfeet, lived in Missoula, was really one of the great Native American writers, great writer in any sense. And he had a book come out in the 70s called Winter in the Blood. And that was a seminal work. A lot of the Native writers at this conference, a lot of people in general, mentioned that as a seminal work in their life. And another one, which I'm reading now, I didn't read it when it came out. This would be a whole new experience. It's James Welch, Fool's Crow.
I haven't read that. No.
Oh yeah, it's set in the 1850s, but it's told from in a Blackfeet voice in that moment.
Cool. Inside
a culture, going on a raid against the Crow, and there's all this drama, but it's really like here's the voice from the inside, and even the names. I mean, there's one guy's name like Heavy Shield, or White Man's Dog. There are these names, there are all these names that you realize, well, yeah, that's the way it worked. Is that we have names like John and Fred and Harry, and there are all these Indian names, and so it's like, wow, this is a whole different world. Like everything is very kind of powerful physically, and there's sort of a spiritual element to all those physical items. It's cool. Anyway, it's Fool's Crow by James Welch.
Those are awesome, and I haven't read any of those, so we'll have links to those in the notes. But Peter, man, I'm so happy to get this opportunity to talk with you. I've just been such a fan, and we didn't even get to talk about like your history, your personal history, and your writing history.
Oh, that's
you go about writing. We got to do another part 2, 3, 4, but we'll definitely do another one, assuming I didn't embarrass myself when your new book comes out. Anyway, thank you so much.
Well,
I loved it.
But just let people know it's available at Scribd.
Yes.
This book. It's an online subscription and publishing service, SCRIBD, called Sins of the Founding Father.
Yep, and we will have links to all that. But Peter, thanks so much.
Okay, thanks so much. Really fun to talk to you, Ed. We'll do it again.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way, so head to mountainprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.